Is eating meat wrong? As we've seen from the Norcross article, the suffering animals experience in the factory farm industry is often used to make the case against purchasing and eating meat. An article by Julia Driver called Individual Consumption and Moral Complicity takes a similar stance, arguing that consuming factory farm products is wrong, specifically calling out the consumer's complicity in the pain and suffering of animals. Some stances, such as Ben Bramble's The Case Against Meat, go one step further, as Bramble argues that raising and killing animals for food, or RKF, is bad altogether, even in cases of free-range farming, and should be stopped completely. In this video, I'm going to attempt to defend the argument that meat consumption is morally permissible by responding to the issues brought up by Julia Driver and Ben Bramble. I'll briefly go over their points and offer my thoughts on how their arguments against meat may be flawed, too demanding, and unrealistic. We'll start with Driver's article on moral complicity. Now in this article, she argues how, despite not killing the animals themselves, consumers of factory farm products can be blameworthy for purchasing and eating meat, since factory farming involves the intentional killing of animals and promotes their suffering. And since consumers are willingly participating in this wrongdoing by being a part of the meat industry at all, they become complicit. According to Driver, when the consumer eats meat and enjoys it, they're cooperating with evil. Driver is specifically talking about factory farm meat, which is more problematic given its often inhumane treatment of animals. An ideal case would be to get ethically sourced meat, but as Bramble will argue later, killing the animals at all may pose ethical problems. So would a consumer be morally complicit in these animal deaths? The type of moral complicity Driver discusses involves tolerance complicity, where the consumer of factory farm products isn't causally complicit, but is rather involved in the failure to stand up to evil by kind of quasi-participation in the practice. An immediate issue that comes to mind with the complicity approach is that complicity must involve support of an immoral practice, and defining evil is very subjective. A failure to stand up to this subjective form of evil opens up a world of things people may be complicit in. I think this poses a real problem with using complicity as a basis for not eating meat. Consider another example of willingly being a participant in the killing of animals: pest control. If I had rats in my house, am I morally complicit in having an exterminator kill them? Well, maybe not if the rats pose a threat to my health. This may be written off as a form of self-preservation, but either way, the rats didn't intend to harm me, and killing the rats in the end benefited me. Despite my reasoning, the rats are still dead, and I willingly intended for that to happen with the exterminators. But even beyond pest control, participating in human society at all seems to have an element of moral complicity when considering the harms humans have created for urban wildlife as a result of urbanization. We saw this in Nicholas Dellon's article, where he talked about how animals in cities have become more vulnerable to threats from cars to buildings or traps, poison, and predation. Even if we as individuals didn't interfere with the animals' ecosystems to build our streets and homes, we still participate in human society and reap the benefits of the harm caused to animals in their displacement. Because of this, a person seems no more complicit in the suffering of animals when they enjoy eating meat than when they enjoy participating in human society at all. But Driver already predicted this sort of thing would be a problem. She mentions how the complicity approach can be problematic because it is too broad, and as a result, avoiding complicity would become very difficult. She uses the petroleum industry as an example, since the industry can also be considered problematic, and petroleum products are also common and difficult to avoid. Driver decides to overlook this issue, pointing out that a key difference between the meat industry and examples such as the petroleum industry is that you can avoid eating meat since there are other options available, while avoiding products from the petroleum industry is more difficult. However, this conclusion assumes that there are other easily accessible options available for everybody, which is not always the case. For one, restaurants don't generally have many vegan options, if any, but more importantly, people may also not financially be in a place to put extra time and resources into buying or making vegan alternatives. Even if someone were aware of the harms of the meat industry, would they still be in the wrong for choosing the cheaper packet of hot dogs, for example, over the ethically sourced organic plant-based meat alternative that is more expensive and most likely not available at the average dollar store? To sum up this first part, since there seem to be other common cases besides eating meat where we would be complicit in the suffering of animals to benefit ourselves, and considering that not eating meat may not be a viable option for some, using complicity to argue against meat consumption seems too demanding. Because of this, it would be unfair for eating meat to be considered morally impermissible under this reasoning. Now to Ben Bramble's article. Bramble argues against meat, claiming it is bad for animals and for us, with four main points. First, that RKF is bad for animals because it gives them worse lives than they would have had. Second, the pleasures of eating meat are not a significant net loss, and may not be a net loss at all, given the potential psychological costs associated with eating meat. Third, people make the mistake of believing that human well-being is more valuable than animal well-being. And fourth, the idea that we can't save or improve animal lives is not a reason to object to the case against meat, and he continues to push the idea that the self-interested reason of the psychological costs of meat eating may be a sufficient reason to stop eating meat. Responding to his first point that RKF, even in cases of free-range farming, is bad for animals by giving them worse or shorter lives, I'd say that it's possible that the lives of these animals may not have been better at all. Thinking back to another article we read from Oscar Horta, called Debunking the Idyllic View of Natural Processes, he argued that animals' lives in the wild may be filled with more suffering than the idealized version of nature we picture, emphasizing that most of them never reach adulthood, and in most cases their lives contain little more than suffering. But from a practical standpoint, it seems highly unlikely that these animals raised for food would be able to return to the wild anyway, or survive without human care. With this in mind, it also seems unlikely that humans would continue to contribute resources of this scale to taking care of these animals for nothing in return if we were to stop RKF. The best case scenario for the animals that humans would realistically accommodate for seems to be for us to continue to take care of the animals humanely and allow them to live a good life on free-range farms, and then slaughter them with ethical methods that don't promote the unnecessary kinds of suffering seen at factory farms. Considering Bramble's second and fourth points, I won't spend time on the potential negative psychological effects of eating meat that he brings up, since it's very speculative, and he even acknowledges this as so. But I will get into the point of the loss of eating meat not being a net loss. One case that Bramble mentioned was the cultural considerations of meat, and how meat is incorporated in a lot of cultural dishes. So, one might argue that the joy from eating this meat and participating in culture overrides the death of the animals. But Bramble dismissed this, offering a solution that giving up cultural traditions involving meat can be compensated by reinventing the dishes in vegetarian ways. And he also made the point that removing meat doesn't sever all cultural ties to the past in one's community. Therefore, to Bramble, avoiding meat isn't a net loss. But imposing on other cultures in this way seems problematic. Just because the author thinks the elimination of meat wouldn't make a significant difference doesn't mean it's true. After all, his opinion is not representative of individual perspectives within those cultures. In my opinion, it is not our place to dictate what other cultures should or should not be eating, since we are outside that culture, and meat in certain dishes may play a more important role than we think, creating a bigger loss than Bramble imagines. So claiming that meat consumption is morally impermissible seems imposing to cultures whose food often incorporates meat, and it may produce a greater loss in the lives of those people in comparison to the lives of animals who are, ideally, able to live happy lives being cared for by people to then be ethically killed and used for a greater purpose. Finally, to the author's third point, that people make the mistake of believing that human well-being is more valuable than animal well-being. In saying this, Bramble seems to imply that the two are equally important, when in application, that just isn't the case. Again, I'm not saying that we should treat animals horribly, just that the value of human well-being and animal well-being is not the same. So using this as a grounds for the moral impermissibility of eating meat seems iffy to me. For example, if we had to choose between saving a human life and an animal life, we would most likely place importance on human life. Along with this idea that the lives of different creatures have different values, I think it becomes clear that people have a hierarchy when we use the example of insects or pests, which I touched on earlier. If the value of human and animal well-being were equal, that would include all animals, such as rats and mice, and it also seems hypocritical not to include insects, which also may be capable of suffering. Killing flies because they're annoying or killing spiders in your house would become ethically questionable, since their lives are being cut short. When considering suffering and death, if we had to eliminate killing animals for food under a similar rationale, we should also stop killing pests and encouraging pest control, which would be problematic for human society and well-being, as I previously discussed. In both cases of meat consumption and pest control, animals are being killed for human benefit. If meat consumption and reaping the benefits of RKF were morally impermissible, then it should also be morally impermissible to kill pests. especially ones that seem to pose no threat to your health, and this is too demanding and unrealistic, so meat consumption remains morally permissible. While I do advocate for ethical methods that treat animals humanely in free range farming, I hope that I've shown that the arguments against meat have the ability to be reasonably challenged, and since they can be challenged, I stand by the idea that people are not morally obligated to avoid eating meat.